Well, hello, everyone, and welcome back to those of you who have joined us for the last few sessions. My name's Ashley Mueller, and I'm the Manager of Educational Programs at NBPHE. Really excited for you to be here. So, just as the last few sessions, I'll continue to monitor chat, and we'll be answering questions at the end of the presentation. So if you have any questions for our presenter, please make sure to use the Q&A section to put those questions to answer at the end of the presentation. Once again, we will be doing our raffle for the APHA CPH Review Exam Guide. So anyone who's here today live, you are automatically entered in that raffle. Last time's winner was Carolyn Nifton. So congratulations, Carolyn. So now on to our topic. Our today's topic is evidence-based approaches to public health, presented by Anthony Dissen. Dr. Dissen is a professor in the School of Health Sciences at Stockton University. As a public and population health educator and researcher, his scholarly work focuses on the intersections between queer and gender non-binary communities and the health system, as well as exploring how nutrition and health information is shared, understood, and utilized by consumers of health information, particularly online and social media channels. So that, I would like to turn it over to Dr. Dissen.
Wonderful. Ashley, thank you as always. Thank you so much, everybody, for being here today. I really love presenting on this topic regarding the CPH exam. And I hope that any information and review that I can share today will be helpful for you all as you're doing your own preparations. So, as with all the different domains of the exam, the evidence-based approach is one, right, makes up approximately 10%. And what I always try to share to people regarding this area of preparation, because I know for certain people based on their area of work and based on their own previous background in education, I think sometimes this is the section that can cause some anxiety because it's the biostatistics and the epidemiology section, which can feel quite daunting. So my two pieces of encouragement or reminder that I tend to give is one, remember, it's just 10%, right? So it's just about 5% of the questions will be epi and the other 5 will be biostats, and that's it. So it's not like that's the whole big chunk of the exam. And the other thing to remind ourselves, at least what I think can sometimes be helpful, is in some ways, this section can actually be rather straightforward because we're talking about epidemiology and biostatistics. There sometimes isn't quite as much double guessing that we can get into with some other areas, or the ways that we can kind of convince ourselves, well, all 4 of the possible answers can be correct based on how you look at it. That's the nice thing sometimes about our mathematic aspects of public health, is that it sort of just is. And so I think that can be a good reminder in your own preparations, that in some ways, this can be one of the more straightforward aspects. And so for some of you, this might be quite just basic cursory review, especially if you do a lot in biostatistics or epidemiology, or if this was a significant portion of past education of yourselves. And for some, this might be a little more on the newer side. So what I want to share here is the way in which these two concepts are covered in the CPH exam, especially with the idea of its overall application to the field of public health. So as a reminder, biostatistics, what we're doing here is applying basic statistics methods to biological organisms. Of course, in our purposes, this is going to be the health of people and populations, versus epidemiology, which is more of how determinants of health-related events, as they are distributed across populations. So heavily related to one another, very much both sides of the same coin. But whereas biostatistics, of course, is very heavy more on the models and the formulas that are used to try to understand what is happening as we study biological organisms or people, epidemiology is more on those health determinants and health outcomes aspect of things. So as we are talking about some of these concepts for today, couple key things to remember. Your assessment on the CPH exam of these concepts is going to be based on your ability to interpret, to apply, and to identify. Right? You're not going to have to open up SPSS while you're going through the exam, right? It's not going to be heavy use of statistical equations, it's going to be, as a public health professional and worker, how are you able to take statistical information? How are you able to take epidemiologic information and apply it in the public health approaches to overall populations and people? It's our ability to understand and apply that information more so sometimes than needing to worry about memorizing equations or things along those lines. So again, just as a particular area of reminder that I think can be helpful, especially if this is an area, again, of the domains that gives you any pause. So we're going to start by talking about biostatistics. And as we go over some of that key information, we'll transition into the epidemiology side of things. And with biostatistics, of course, what we're talking about here is data and our ability to take collected data and properly analyze it and interpret its value in how we are understanding the health of a population or a group of people. The reason why we use biostatistics is that because for most purposes, it is not possible to study an entire population, right? There's going to be financial and time-based restrictions. If I want to know the health of an entire state, it's just, unless anyone's just bringing in limitless amounts of grant dollars and years, if not decades of time, it's just not possible. So we take samples from the larger population, we gather information, and we generate what are called parameters to be able to interpret the data that we have found to make some kind of overall assessment or estimate about this theoretical larger population that we couldn't study in full. But if we have collected a sample appropriately, and if we apply the correct statistical tools, we can come close to what we might think of as the truth or the answer about what's happening within a population. So know these terms, and again, just some of these different kinds of characteristics that what the population refers to is the largest possible collection of people that we're interested in studying or observing. So this can be defined by any number of demographics or other kinds of characteristics. And the parameters are the specific measurements gathered from the population. Since, again, we can't necessarily touch upon an entire population unless the population that we're working with is uniquely small, instead, we're going to work with a sample, which is going to be appropriately gathered representation of the larger population. And what we do here is we use statistics to make inferences about the population. And what that statistic is, like how a parameter is to population, the statistic is to the sample. It is the characteristic or the measurement gathered from the sample that we use to try to understand the population as a whole. So we compute these statistics, right, these measurements from the sample that we've gathered, and we use them to estimate the parameters about our population of interest. We can categorize or think about the different kinds of statistics that we might be interested in based on whether we are collecting and developing descriptive statistics or inferential statistics. And based on the kind of work that we're doing or the kind of questions we're trying to answer, we may focus on one or we might use both in coming to our final conclusions. So descriptive statistics is just a summary of the general characteristics that we've gathered. Within descriptive statistics, we're not necessarily making any definitive claims just of yet. Rather, we are just saying this is what was observed. So this is where terms like mean, median, mode, range, standard deviation, the development of tables, graphs, charts, figures, etc., comes from. It is just sort of that raw description. This was the average. This was the standard deviation from the mean. This is the overall range of results that were found, right? It just is. We're not necessarily making a claim whether that was good or bad information or whether it showed that the hypothesis was true or not. It is simply a statement of what was described. Inferential statistics, then, is we take it that final step further, and we take the data gathered and we take these descriptive statistics and we try to come to some kind of conclusion. What does this data tell us? What is it that we can say about this population or this group of people based on inferences made, again, through the appropriate application different kinds of statistical data. So this is where we have t-tests, linear regressions, et cetera, start to come. This is where we're starting to make more declarative statements about what this data might mean about the population that we're studying. So let's start with descriptive statistics. The data gathered can be described in this descriptive statistics category as either categorical or continuous in nature. So categorical data describes qualities, traits, attributes, etc. These can be further subgrouped because we love our various seemingly infinite ways of trying to group data as ordinal, nominal, or dichotomous in nature. And we'll talk about what each three of these things mean in a moment. Now, continuous data focuses a little bit more on how much or how many of something was possessed. And this is typically described as an interval or as a ratio. So the way that we might want to think about this as you're doing, again, your own study preparation is to think the data that I'm looking at, is this talking about qualities, traits, attributes, etc.? That's going to tell us that it is categorical in nature. If instead I'm talking about just quantities and amounts and those sorts of things, kind of just purely numerical, I'm talking a little bit more about continuous information. So if I'm looking at qualities, traits, etc., if it is dichotomous, we're looking at some kind of trait that only has two possible values: exposed, unexposed, positive, negative, present, absent, right? It is just heads or tails, right? It's just dichotomous in nature. It is simply how many people were exposed versus how many people were not exposed to a carcinogen, right? Just the quality there, and it has either one of two possible answers. If there's more than two possible values that might come across, but it's still talking about traits and qualities and things of this nature, we could have it as ordinal in nature, which is where there is inherent order and rank, but we don't necessarily know the distance between those ranks. And a commonly used example here is level of education. So for example, if the quality that we're looking at or the trait we're looking at is education, high school completed, some bachelor's versus a complete bachelor's degree, some master's degree, some postmaster's doctoral degree. There's inherent order there. We know that this is information that follows a sequence. But for some people, they go from their high school to their bachelor's, their master's, their doctorate within weeks of completing the first and going into the second, where other people might complete their bachelor's, go back for their master's in 5 years, wait another 15 years, go back for a doctorate. Just because I know somebody has a master's degree, I don't really know how much time passed between that and their high school diploma. So that is ordinal. There is inherent rank, but we don't necessarily know the distance between those ranks. Nominal data has no clear order. So for example, marital status, single versus married versus divorced versus partnered, et cetera. There's no first, second necessarily there. If you're looking at a person's employee ID number or student ID number, it's just information, racial demographics, et cetera. It's just there, right? It's just a way of saying this was a person's marker or identifier. So that is nominal. There's no real order in terms of how information comes across. It's a little more just random in that way. Continuous, since we're talking about specific quantities or amounts, can be either an interval, which tends to lack a true zero, and numbers are just continuous, such as pH and temperature, right? Theoretically, they can kind of just keep being ranked out. Whereas ratios do have a true zero, and they tend to act as true ratios like height or length, weight, etc. So again, some of these kinds of measurements of people or measurements of a sample population. When we're talking about how this data can be displayed, so for example, let's say you're looking at a question on the CPH exam, and it's talking about data, it's talking about information gathered, and it might say, what would be the best way to visually display this information? Should it be as a histogram, as a bar chart? Should it be a whisker plot, a pie chart, things of that nature? Ordinal data, since it tends to fall within a certain aspect of frequencies and cumulative frequencies, et cetera, typically we're going to show is either a histogram or a bar chart based on whether we have a lot of values or just a few values to look at. Continuous data, if we're talking about mean, median, standard deviation, mode, range, etc. Box plot, whisker plot, histograms. And then finally, nominal and dichotomous data, where we have frequencies and relative frequencies. We're going to focus more on either bar charts or pie charts. So again, just ways to sort of think about how we might take this data and best visually describe it or visually display it. This might be some of the ways in which we would focus on one particular type of visual representation versus the other. So which of the following would be an example of a nominal variable? So take a moment here, read through this, and just think to yourself how you would, if this was a question you came across on the exam, which of these, income level, state of residence, year of graduation, or level of satisfaction?
Is this the first poll?
Yes.
Okay.
So take a moment, answer on the poll when it comes available to you about what you think would be the most correct answer here, and then we'll go through from there. Okay, so it seems that the majority of people listed B, state of residence, as the nominal variable. Kind of a close then mix from there between A, income level, and C, year of graduation, with level of satisfaction receiving the smallest amount. So if you said B, state of residence, you are correct. So if you answered A, C, or D, the reason why B would be the most correct answer here is that state of residence has no inherent order of rank or value. So if somebody lives in Virginia versus Iowa versus New Jersey versus Pennsylvania, one doesn't necessarily rank higher or lower than another. So this is why it would fall more within that nominal category. All right, excellent, very good. So second poll, again, take a moment, come through, take your time with it, and then answer how you would feel that which would be the most correct answer here regarding if a researcher is conducting this kind of work. Would this be ratio, nominal, ordinal, or interval?
Seconds.
All right. So again, it's kind of interesting. About same thing about 2/3 answered here C, ordinal, with relatively almost kind of even mix between ratio and nominal, and then finally interval. So for this particular question, if you answered ordinal, that was correct. And the reason here, what makes this different than our previous question with nominal? Nominal has no natural order or ranking, whereas something here with education level that does, right? High school, then undergrad, then grad, etc. The reason why it would be ordinal versus like a ratio or an interval or something to that effect is that, again, there's no even spacing necessarily between the ranks. It just tells us that one level of education comes before the other. So for these first couple questions, if you're answering them correctly, these are terms that you're understanding. And if not, that is okay, because it just shows you where you might want to take a little time just to make a note about how to best remember nominal versus ordinal. because there's really even nothing in the names that give them that much help to remember one versus the other. So it's just something to reflect on and refresh on a little bit with some of these skills. Excellent. So again, just some quick reminders. Hopefully the mean, median, mode range we all remember, but if not, just as a quick reminder that what each of these is referring to in case, again, you see a question that's talking about the mean versus the median, because average doesn't necessarily mean middle, although sometimes they are one and the same. This kind of information is not always numerical in nature. It's just expressed numerically. So for example, again, not to be too repetitive with this as an example, but let's say education level, the average education level in terms of how many people answered high school versus bachelor's versus master's, that's all verbal, but we're going to represent or express that numerically with the average answer or the most common value if we're talking about the mode or something to that effect. So when we're talking about descriptive statistics and other kinds of areas we can start to get into, count, again, just as some basic terminology, is just the number of cases of some kind of phenomenon. So number of college students diagnosed with hepatitis B this semester, right, would just be the count. How we then start to make sense of that can be looked at whether we're talking about a proportion, a ratio, or a rate. So proportions state that count, let's say college students diagnosed with hepatitis B, relative to the size of the larger group in which we are studying. So this could be how many students have hepatitis B in comparison to all the students living on campus in dormitories this academic term. With a proportion, the numerator is a subset of the denominator, meaning so that, A over A plus B, meaning everybody else. Since we're typically going to give this as a percentage, we're usually going to see this multiplied by 100. So 38% of male students, of all the male students living in dorms this semester, were diagnosed with hepatitis B, something to that effect. A ratio is going to look at where the numerator, the top number, is not a subset of the denominator. So we're going to look at students with hepatitis B compared to students with hepatitis A, or the number of male identifying students to female identifying students, right? So the way that we can determine whether we're looking at a proportion or a ratio is whether that numerator is a subset of that denominator or not. With a rate, it's going to be similar to proportions and to ratios, but here we're going to see the denominator is a specified period of time. So number of students with hepatitis B compared to all dormitory students in 2022. Number of flu cases in comparison to COVID cases in 2023. So if we're talking about a specified period of time, now we're looking at a rate versus just a pure proportion or ratio. So for example, a kind of question that you might see on the exam is something to the effect of, what would be the proportion of college students with hepatitis B among all college students living in the university's dorms? And we'd be given some kind of a table. In this case, we're going to see our A, number of students with hep B, our B, number of students living in the dorms who are not diagnosed with hep B, and then our A plus B, our total denominator, is going to be all those students. And so if we were to be given a question that was built along this kind of a prompt, we would just want to remember proportion is A over A plus B times 100. So it would be, 1150 divided by 4960. A common mistake people might make is they might just divide A into B, forgetting that B is only a portion of what we're looking at because we got to have that denominator include A as well. So a common slip up people might make might just be to take 1150 divided into 3810 versus 1150 into 4,960. So this is more just a kind of think for yourself. I don't have this as a particular poll here. This is just sort of a, sorry, that's confusing on my part. So this is just as a quick kind of self-reflection to yourself is, which of the following would be best expressed as a count? Male births compared to female births just in total, female births compared to female and male births and female births in 2022 compared to the population at midpoint in 2022. So not so much, you're not going to see a question like this on the exam, but just for your own self-check-in, if you will, at this point, just to kind of recognize some of these terms. Which of the following would be expressed as a count? It would be B, because we're just looking at a raw number here. Which of the following would be best expressed as a proportion? It's going to be C, because we want that denominator to include our numerator, in this case, female births. Which of these would be specifically a ratio? For here would be A, because the numerator and the denominator are not containing each other. They're two separate counts. And then finally, rate, of course, would be D, because here we're talking about something specifically bound by time. So when we're talking about probability and sampling and these sorts of aspects with descriptive statistics, suppose a sample mean, right? So we're taking a sample from a larger population, and suppose this mean can be used to estimate the larger population. But let's say we took a second sample sometime later from the same population, but the sample mean now is different, right? They're not always going to be the same. So the way that we account for this kind of variation is going to be by being mindful of the sampling distribution that we are utilizing. So when we're thinking about the different kinds of sampling that we can utilize, a simple random sample is we just enumerate all members of a population. Everybody just gets a random, number. We select small n individuals at random. So we're just, of the, let's say, 50,000 people, we're going to select 500 at random. And our random number generator just spits out everybody has an equal probability of being selected. That would be a simple random sample. We have a large population, pulled this many people from it. Everybody had an equal chance of being selected. A systematic sample starts with a particular sampling frame in mind. We're going to determine the sampling interval, again, comparing the large population, capital N, to the small sample, the little n. Select the first person at random, and then we're going to go every 6 people from there, or every 5 people from there, every 100 people from there. So we have a little more of a specific process in place. And then we can also do what's called a stratified sample, where we're going to organize the population into mutually exclusive strata, because maybe we really want to make sure we're having good representation of age, of racial demographics. We're having good representation of weight status, of a level of education, et cetera. And we want to make sure we're not too just heavily focused in one area or too minimized in another. And we're going to select individuals at random within each strata. Once we have all this data, there's different ways in which the findings can be distributed. So what's called a normal or a Gaussian distribution is that nice classic bell curve. This is going to be best used for continuous variables. Data is going to be symmetrically distributed about the mean. And with a normal distribution, there's no skews. We're not skewing left or right. We're just getting that good classic bell curve where 50% of the values are above the mean, the other 50% are below the mean. We create this and describe this by that mean, and then whatever standard deviation that we are looking at. We follow what is called the empirical rule, where if we look at one standard deviation from the mean, about 68% of all values will fall within that. 95% will fall within 2 standard deviations, and about almost everybody, 99.7%, will fall within 3. We can do a binomial distribution with dichotomous outcomes. Why? Because with dichotomous, only 2 outcomes can occur: heads or tails, exposed or unexposed. And then what's called a Poisson distribution is used for counts, just raw counts, or rate data. Number of events occurring at a specified period of time. So for example, I want to know the number of days since last exposure. I want to know the number of text messages the hotline received. I want to know how many people were admitted to the hospital with RSV. Right now we're going with specific just counts. And perhaps specifically, I want to know how many people were admitted to the hospital with RSV this week, the last month, the last 6 months, if we're looking at a particular unit of time. An important thing to remember when we're talking about data distribution is what's called the central limit theorem. The idea here is that if we take a large enough sample from the population, and this is why picking an appropriate number of people to make up that lowercase n, to make up that sample, is so important. If we take that large enough sample, the mean and that standard deviation from the mean will approximate a normal distribution, meaning the larger the sample size, the more it will get a normal distribution, even if the underlying population is not normally distributed. Which makes sense because most just naturally occurring populations aren't going to follow a nice, easy, beautiful 50% symmetrical distribution. But that's why we want to make sure if we have a particular population of interest, we want to make sure we're taking in large enough sample, because we can get that nice normal distribution, even if that's not necessarily how the sample of the population would look, if we could look at 100% of everybody involved. So for our next poll, thinking about what we've just looked at here, talking about distributions and especially how data can be skewed. Take a moment, read through, take your time. It's always a big thing with test questions, is just to take your time and just see which one you feel would be the most correct answer here.
More seconds.
Okay, interesting. So we see kind of the majority of people would say right skewed, followed by normal, and then sort of an even mix between whether it be left skewed, binomial, etc. The key thing to focus on with this question here is that if it is a large sample. So the reason here it would be C, normal distribution, is that correct? If you said right skewed, that's because, yes, if I were to look at everybody within that population, you would expect it to be, skewed towards the right, towards older age. But remember what we just looked at regarding central limit theorem, is that a population, if we take a large enough sample from it, it will naturally fall within that normal distribution. So when going through questions like this, if the item writers took the time to specifically say that it is a large sample or a small sample, they're trying to help you understand that what you want to look at here is whether or not the distribution of findings, the distribution of data would change because of the sample size taken. So in this case, the mean age of death, because it's a large sample, would still fall relatively within that normal distribution because we have a large sample taken. So with inferential statistics, so again, where we're taking findings and trying to infer about them, we're trying to make sense of them to say, well, what does this mean? Who cares? What does this do for us as the field or as people within public health? With statistical inference, we're trying to generalize the characteristics of the population based on the sample data we've collected. And the way that we make those inference is to subject that data to proper statistical analysis. If we misrepresent the population, if we misrepresent the sample, if we don't use the correct statistical equations or tools available, we're going to introduce bias, or we're going to introduce incorrect inference, and we're going to make an incorrect or a wrong generalization or claim about the population of interest. When we're talking about making inference, we can either make general estimations with the data that we've collected, or we're going to be testing a hypothesis. So if I don't necessarily have a hypothesis, I'm going to be making an estimation. And this is when the population parameter is unknown. I don't know what to think, or whether there is an effect or an ineffect about a treatment, or whether there is a difference in outcomes. So I'm just making estimations. But if I do have an explicit statement about that population parameter, people exposed to this agent have a higher rate of this disease. People who are engaging in this lifestyle behavior have a lower rate of disease. Now we're testing a hypothesis. When we're trying to make inferences about the data that we have found, we need to set up what are called confidence intervals. This refers to the range of values, and it is thought that this range of values has a high probability of containing the true population parameter. We, of course, can't say this with 100% certainty because we didn't test the whole population. We only have our sample to work with. But if we've used appropriate confidence intervals, we can say to a certain level of confidence, we really feel strongly that the data falling within this range is true. It is making a true statement about the population of interest. Point estimates are single value estimates of population parameters based on the data that we have. This is the best single number estimate. Confidence interval estimates, on the other hand, refer again to that larger range of value and that level of confidence. And that typically is what we're going to find used a little bit more. Confidence levels are typically set at either 90%, 95%, or 99%. You are potentially, again, based on your own work or education, you might, recognize our good friend here, 0.05, 95% confidence interval if you've ever set a p-value before these sorts of things. And so the confidence level is 1 minus level of significance. So the alpha here that we have is our little level of significance, which we can set as low as, 0.2, meaning our interval range has about 80% confidence of containing the truth. We can set it at, if 1 minus 0.1, we're going to say 90%. As we narrow let me say that the other way. If we increase our sample size, we will narrow the confidence interval, meaning, again, large enough sample, good enough N, we have a more narrow confidence. We can state with greater confidence that what we have here contains this answer. The confidence interval increases as the interval gets wider and contains a larger range of possible values. So when we think about this in terms of our application of public health work, the idea here is to say, how certain or with how much confidence can we say that whatever claim we're going to be making about a phenomenon that we've witnessed, about an intervention, about a risk factor for disease, to what degree can we say that there is truth to this? This is why we typically have hypothesis, because we usually want to know whether something has effect or not. So when we're testing a hypothesis versus just making an estimation, we create some kind of statement about the population parameter. We're always kind of making this claim about the population. Let's say we are conducting a test to see whether heavy metal contamination in the water supply of a community is impacting the growth and development of that children. In a perfect world, we would be able to test every single child within that community, but again, time, finances, worker power, et cetera, might make that impossible. So instead, we are going to generate a sample and collect data from a certain number of children or a certain number of people within this community. And then we want to see whether or not this heavy metal contamination is having some kind of outcome. The null hypothesis, which is where we start, is the statement of no effect. So we start with the null hypothesis saying this exposure leads to no change of outcome. In this case, the null hypothesis would say heavy metal within the water of the community is not impacting the growth and development of the children within that community. The alternative hypothesis, or the research hypothesis, mimics the research question of interest. In this case, it would be the levels of heavy metal within the local water do impact the growth and development of children. A key thing to remember here, we're focusing on the null hypothesis. So in this case, we are either rejecting the null or we fail to reject the null. And that's just an important kind of thought process we want to keep in mind, is that we're always focusing on whether or not to reject or fail to reject the null hypothesis versus trying to prove the research hypothesis. And that's just a common mistake a lot of people make in research, is the idea is that I'm trying to prove my hypothesis correct. But again, that can introduce bias or other kinds of issues. Instead, we start from the determination of whether to reject or fail to reject this statement of no association. The reason for this is that we are always trying to reduce error. And there's two major types of errors that we can work with when we're talking about statistical analysis. We're going to make errors because we can't measure everybody. And so we want to make sure that that sample and the people within it and the data collected and the research, the statistics applied to that data is as accurate and true as possible. We're trying to minimize error. So a type 1 error is when we reject a null hypothesis when the null hypothesis is true. In other words, claiming that there is an effect when there is no effect. So for our example here, let's say if we were to get to the absolute truth of this exposure, the absolute truth is the current levels of heavy metals within the water are not impacting growth and development within children. But based on how we collected data, based on how we analyze that data, we come to the statement that yes, there is indeed an effect. This heavy metal levels in the water is impacting growth rates and development. That is a type 1 error. We rejected the null hypothesis when we should have failed to reject the null hypothesis because we're claiming that there is an effect when there really is none. A type 2 error is just the opposite. We failed to reject the null hypothesis by overlooking an effect that really does exist. So in this case, if the level of heavy metals within the water really is impacting childhood growth and development, but we fail to reject the null and we're saying, no, there was no connection, we are saying that there was no effect when there truly was an effect there. And so, of course, we're always trying to minimize the likelihood of conducting either error so that whatever conclusion we come to is as close to the truth as possible. So if we're writing this out, this is our question. The null hypothesis, there's no difference. Our alternative hypothesis, there is a difference. The p-value, so we talked about our confidence intervals. So the p-value provides us the probability of obtaining a result that is at least as strong as the result actually observed under the belief, and I know this is a lot of words here, but under the belief that the null hypothesis is correct. Because again, we're always focusing on the kind of default assumption that there is no association. If we keep that p-value small, or really I should say if we analyze our data and have a small p-value, what it means is that the observed outcome, what we found, is very unlikely to occur under the null hypothesis, meaning that if we have a small p-value, any association found is likely to be correct. So that alpha level, that little a, is the threshold we set, and we compare the alpha to the p. So most statistical research is done setting an alpha level at 0.05. It can be lower because it's a 0.01. It can be higher. We could set it to 0.1 or even 0.2. But typically, we're going to see most research default to set that alpha at 0.05. We then conduct our statistical analysis, whatever it is that it is, and we get our p-value. And our computers spit out that the p-value is 0.02. And so what we look here is say, how does the alpha level set compare to the p-value found? If the p-value typically is less than whatever we've set the alpha level to, we can reject the null hypothesis with confidence. So if I've set my alpha level to 0.05 and the p-value is 0.02, that means we can say, no, there is an outcome here. There is an association between exposure and outcome. So I'm going to reject the null and instead go to my alternative hypothesis and say, this appears to be true. We set small alpha levels in order to what we call protect the null. And the reason we do this is we don't want to make a claim of association when there is none. Now, if we set that alpha level too low, we could be missing a true association if we make it too stringent. And that's why we typically use the 0.05 as sort of a generally agreed upon good alpha level to work with. There are a few different explanations why the value of the sample differs from the hypothesized parameter under that null hypothesis. This can be because of random variation, just random sampling. If we sampled again, we'd have a completely different outcome, or actual difference. And so this is why if we use good sampling methods, whether we need to do stratified or simple random or whatever we've picked a good appropriate n size, we've got a good sample. All of that is led so that when we come to whatever conclusion we come to, if we have that p-value set and it is found to be below that alpha level, we can really say, no, there is a true difference here because we have designed our research in such a way to minimize the opportunities for bias or error to work their way in. When we're talking about statistics, sometimes we'll see this term statistical power. And what power refers to is our ability to reject the null hypothesis when it is false. We increase the power of a study by increasing that alpha, increasing the effect size, and increasing the sample size. So the way that's just kind of sometimes easy to remember is as things are increased, power increases. Like they follow each other in a nice way that way. So with inferential statistics, we're going to set up our null hypothesis, our research or alternative hypothesis. We're going to select the alpha level, typically, again, 0.05, but whatever we feel is best. We're going to select our test statistics. We're going to set up our decision rule, right? So the p-value has to be less than 0.05, or it has to be less than 0.2, or whatever we've selected regarding our alpha. We carry out our computations via, we use R, we use SPSS, whatever we've selected. We have our findings, and then we draw our conclusions and summarize the significance. This is where we make that inference about what we have found. So next poll question. So which of these is an example of a type 1 error?
Mm-hmm. 10 more seconds.
All right, so we've got quite a confident answer here that for A, rejecting a true null hypothesis, and then a little bit on accepting the true null, and then kind of an even split between B and D about rejecting or accepting a true alternate hypothesis. So it's good to see the majority of people saw this correctly with A, rejecting the true null. Now, if you didn't pick A, just some things to keep in mind. Remember, we're always focused on the null. So technically, we could look at this and know B and D automatically can't be correct because we're not talking about the alternative or the research hypothesis. We're talking only about the null. So even if I had zero idea, I could know it's at least a 50-50 between A and C. So we always want to focus on, remember, the null is what we looked at. We don't focus on the alternate. The other thing from there is that we don't accept the null. We either reject it or we fail to reject it. So just keeping some of those concepts in mind, some of the lingo and terminology that we utilize can help you that if you come across a question and you think, I'm not 100% certain here, but I know it focuses on the null, and we don't ever accept the null. We either reject it or fail to reject it. So just some things to keep in mind there, but very well done. Excellent. So the ability for our next poll question, the ability to reject a false null hypothesis. Does this refer to our confidence, our hypothesis testing, our level of significance, or the power?
Ten more seconds.
All right, interesting here. So we got kind of almost like an exact 25% breakdown. Makes sense. So again, if this is an area that you don't feel particularly confident in, it just shows you this is an area to go back in and look at. So for here, it's power. So our ability to reject the null hypothesis when the null hypothesis is false refers to our power. So if a statistical test doesn't have the power to reject the null when the null is false, it's not the right statistical test to select. So when we're talking about our ability here to correctly reject or not reject the null hypothesis, that is referring to its power. The probability of rejecting a true null hypothesis. So for our next poll question here, take a moment, and again, just the probability of rejecting a true null hypothesis is described by what? It's p-value, alpha level, confidence interval, or power.
Fifteen more seconds again.
All right, so a little over half are saying p-value, a little bit followed by confidence interval, alpha level, and then one small one for power. So if you said p, correct. So p-value is the probability that the difference observed was chance and that the groups really are alike. So what this is talking about here, and this is what one thing that can help with this if you didn't answer A, is to think about what is the relationship between the alpha level and the p-value. So again, the idea here is that if the p-value we find is 0.02, it means there's a 0.02 chance that what we're observed is by chance, is random. So if we set our alpha level in that confidence interval at 0.05, we're saying that whatever our finding is, if it's 95%, if it's 0.05 or less, we can feel quite strongly that what we're seeing here is not random chance. And that's what that p-value tells us, is that the smaller that p-value, in particular, in comparison to whatever we have set as our alpha level, this is going to tell us the chance that the null hypothesis is true and that there really is no difference here. So if that helps, that can sometimes be a clarifier to recognize, what is alpha level talking about? What is p-value talking about? And more importantly, how do they relate to one another? So a researcher has collected this data on household income levels, as well as whether or not members of that household have been vaccinated against a particular disease. If we were to write this as a null hypothesis, take a moment, read through each of these examples. How would we properly write out the null hypothesis for this particular kind of research study?
I'll leave it open about 10 more seconds. It looks like we are still waiting for a couple of people to answer. Okay.
All right, so little over half answered D, income of the vaccinated does not equal the income of the unvaccinated, followed by B, the income of the vaccinated equals the income of the unvaccinated, excuse me, with a little bit for A and then a little bit for C. So for this particular question, it's B, it doesn't surprise me that we saw the two largest groups of answerings between B and D. So for the fact that so many people answered D, what it really shows is you're absolutely thinking along the right lines here. But remember, with null hypothesis, the idea isn't that they're different. Actually, the idea is that they're the same. There's no distinguishable difference. So with D, if I say that the income of the vaccinated doesn't equal the income of the vaccinated, I'm actually saying that there is a difference. Unlike A or C, where I'm making the claim that the difference is bigger or smaller. It's the reason why it's B is we're saying, no, they're equal. There's no discernible key difference between them. And that's the idea of a null hypothesis, is that there's no discernible difference. With something like D, to have that idea that they're not equal, even though it's not telling us in what direction, it still designates difference. And that's that key differential. So if you answered B, correct. If you answered D, you were 90% of the way there. It's just that reminder that when we're talking about a null, we're saying things are equal across the board. There's no distinguishable difference between, the exposed and the unexposed, or group 1 or group 2. So the other aspect of biostatistics, especially when we're trying to make some kind of inference, when we're trying to make some kind of claim, is how do we pick the correct test? A lot of this is just a familiarization and to a small degree memorization. So don't worry too much about trying to memorize the equations themselves. You want to think about, again, their application. So we want to make sure we're selecting the correct test, because if we don't select the correct test, our ability to correctly reject or fail to reject the null hypothesis will be compromised. So when we're thinking about different kinds of statistical tests that we can select, we pick the test based on the kind of data we've collected. So we don't necessarily go into it saying, I know exactly what test I'm going to use. We collect our data, we look at our research question and say, what would be the best statistical test based on the data that we found? So we're looking at square test of independence. What we're looking at here is categorical or nominal variables. So this is not continuous variables that are independent, meaning they regarding whether they're related to each other or not, excuse me. We can use this kind of test if we only have a table of value that shows frequency counts. And we actually see this pretty often. Typically, this is going to have data value from simple random samples. So again, we've just selected people at random. Everybody had an equal likelihood of being selected. So for example, we go to a mall one day and we do a quick survey of people walking by, and we're trying to see if there's a relationship between a person's political affiliation and their opinions on the environmental health aspects of climate change. So we collect that data. Are you Democrat, Republican, Independent? Do you agree, disagree, indifferent? And right, what do we have here? We just have counts, right? We just have this information. And now we want to look and see, well, is there an association between Democrat, Republican, and Independent? And the answer of agree, indifferent, or disagree. And we'll look at examples of all of this. So with that kind of test of independence, we're looking to see, is there a relationship? We're going to use what's called a t-test if the sample data is continuous, is again randomly sampled from a population, and is homogeneous with regards to variance and is distributed normally. How do we get that nice normal distribution? A great big sample size, if we've properly taken a large sample from the population. We can have what's called a one sample t-test, which is also sometimes called a single sample t-test. This would be when we are looking to see how collected data compares to an unknown population mean. So let's say we have a community health event or a fair, and I want to know if the unknown mean cholesterol of the men in this community is different from the national goal of 200 milligrams per deciliter or less. In this, we're going to take the data and compare it to see whether there is a statistically significant difference between the sample and the population mean. Let's say I want to look at the grams of protein in a sample of workout drinks. The nutrition facts label says that they each contain 25 grams of protein, but is this correct or not? A two-sample t-test or an independent samples t-test is when we're looking to see whether the unknown population mean of two different groups. So now we're not just looking at men's cholesterol compared to total guidelines or one protein drink compared to what it claims to have. Here we're going to have two different groups. So here we're going to use data values that are independent, randomly sampled, but we have two different groups that have equal variance between them. So we might have men's and women's cholesterol. We might have this protein drink and this protein drink, and I want to see, which one's more accurate. If we have more than two groups, then we're going to use ANOVA, analysis of variance or analysis of means, ANOME. So for example, we want to compare the average CPH exam scores of public health professionals in DC to the public health professionals working in Manhattan. Here we would use two sample, right? Because we have our colleagues in DC and our colleagues in Manhattan. Or I want to compare state average of Virginia to the state average of Alaska. Two samples, because we have two different groups that we are looking at. Paired sample t-tests, which are sometimes called dependent sample t-tests, is where we want to see the idea of testing to determine whether the mean difference between two sets of observations is zero. Each study subject or participant is measured twice. So this results in pairs of observations as opposed to just one-time off observations of data. We're going to use this in case control studies, and we'll talk about that in a little bit as we look at epidemiology, or in repeated measure designs. So for example, we want to get some kind of education campaign going to help make sure that restaurant employees are properly washing their hands after using the restroom before they come in contact with food in an effort to reduce hepatitis A. So what we would do here is we would conduct a measurement before the training. So how often are they washing their hands before they watch whatever video we've created or education material we've created, and then after. Because what we're trying to prove here, or what we're trying to discover, I should say, is our training program effective? Is the webinar we created, is the little cartoon that we've created that we're putting up in the bathroom, is it working? So we want to do a before and after and analyze the difference using a paired sample t-test. So we want to know whether an effect of a treatment or of an intervention is working or not. I want to test student exam scores before and after a stress management program, people's blood pressure values before and after, puppy yoga or whatever it is that it might be. We want to be able to show in this case, and this is something we might use a lot in public health work where we're educating the community, right? Is our education program effective? Is our smoking cessation program effective? We have to collect before and after treatment and see how things are panning out. A z-test is similar to a t-test where we're looking at two population means, but in this case, we'll use a z-test if the population standard deviation is known and if the sample size is relatively larger. As mentioned before, if we have a two-sample t-test, we'll use that if we have just two groups, but what if we have more than two groups? This is where we're going to use analysis of variance, or ANOVA. So typically here we have three or more samples and we want to analyze them all at once. So one-way ANOVA, we're going to compare three or more unmatched groups with one independent variable. With a two-way ANOVA, we're seeing how a response is affected by two different independent variables. So let's look at an example. With a one-way ANOVA, researchers who want to test the effect of, let's say, three different anti-smoking interventions on tobacco usage. So anti-smoking commercial 1, anti-smoking commercial 2, anti-smoking commercial 3. We have three different groups here that we're looking at, but what is our independent variable? The intervention is experienced by sample population participants, right? It's, did they get commercial 1, commercial 2, commercial 3, and how did it impact their desire to quit smoking? With two-way ANOVA, since we're looking at two independent variables, now we're comparing which commercial they saw as well as we want to collect data on how many friends of theirs they self-report as using tobacco. And so here we want to see not only how our intervention is impacting people's smoking cessation success, but we want to see also how is that further impacted by whether they have a lot of friends or family or peers that are using tobacco products as well. With regression analysis, this is when we're going beyond bivariate, just yes or no. So we use a regression analysis to quantify linear relationships between variables. Correlational analysis gives insight into the direction and the strength of the relationship between variables. So with linear regression, this is going to predict the value of one based on another. So I have one variable and I can use that to predict the value of another. The dependent variable is the one that we want to predict. The independent variable is the one being used to predict the dependent variable. And again, I know this can be a little bit wordy, so just take it as it is. And these might be something to come back to just because it can start to get a little bit, I don't know, alphabet soupy sometimes with a lot of these different terms. But the idea with linear regression is I have my independent variable, and how can I use that to predict my dependent variable? It can be simple or it can be multiple, but the output here is always continuous. So I want to examine the relationship between body mass index and systolic blood pressure. My independent variable is going to be used to predict the other. So whether I'm starting with one, do I know BMI? And can I use BMI to predict systolic blood pressure? BMI is my independent variable, and my dependent variable would be a person's blood pressure measurement. Logistic regression is used to estimate the probability of an event occurring based on a set of independent variables. So a key thing to remember here that can help with differentiating between linear regression and logistic regression, if I can just go back real quick. Linear regression, one variable to predict another. Logistic regression, one variable, the dependent, an event occurring via a set of data, various independent variables. Whereas with linear regression, our output is continuous. Here, our output is going to be both categorical and dichotomous. Either the outcome did or did not occur. So for example, I want to predict whether this set of data that we have about a population can predict whether or not that person will have a coronary, event, have a heart attack. It's binary, it's dichotomous. It either happened or it didn't happen. And what are the various independent variables that we've collected to determine to see if we can predict whether the heart attack occurs? Cigarette usage, total cholesterol, saturated fat consumption, exercise levels, stress levels, minutes of sleep each night. We have all this data we've collected, and we want to see, can these independent variables be used to predict whether or not the dependent outcome will occur, in this case, a heart attack. So for our next comparison, we might say, okay, I want to know what would be the best statistical test to select here if this is my study. So take a moment, read through, and answer to yourself, which do you think would be the most appropriate test to be used for the kind of analysis you would hope to do?
It's open for about 30 more seconds. It looks like we only have about half the answers so far.
Lots to read through here, yeah, so we can take our time. That's fine.
Okay, everyone, about 10 more seconds.
All right, so we have about half saying two sample t-test, next chi-square test or B, and then from there, some people said paired t-test, and from some people said ANOVA. So, kind of a heavy emphasis on two sample t-test with the rest distributed from there. So for this, it would be the chi-square test. And so if you answered B, excellent. If you answered something different, ways that you can remind yourself of whether or not you're looking at one test to be the best option versus the other. So the reason it wouldn't be A, because remember with a paired T test, that's the intervention of seeing if our hand washing cartoon works or not. There's no before and after in this particular example, so it wouldn't be paired. It wouldn't be C, the two sample T test, because that's only used for continuous data. Because what do we have here? We have categorical and non-continuous. We're asking these men, were you screened, yes or no? And it can't be ANOVA because ANOVA is only used when there's 3 or more samples. So if you answered because you really weren't entirely sure or familiar, think about with each of these tests, what is the criteria? Because again, the idea behind choosing the right statistical test is the idea of which one is going to be the correct one for the data we've collected. So is our data categorical? Is it nominal? Is it continuous? Those are some of the things we want to keep in mind because that can give a tremendous amount of insight to what the correct answer will be. So for our next question, so which test would be used for comparing the mean ages of comparisons between two groups?
Okay, about 10 more seconds.
All right, so we have quite a strong answer here for two sample t-tests, fall a little bit by ANOVA, and then kind of an equal final few for a chi-square or Fisher's exact. So excellent, very good job for those that answered A, correct, two sample t-test. Why? Two sample t-tests are used to test whether an unknown population mean of two groups are equal or not. And that's kind of the key thing here is we have two means that we want to look at. For those that said ANOVA, again, just as a quick reminder for ANOVA, that's always going to be for 3 or more groups. So since we only have 2 groups here, wouldn't be ANOVA. If you thought chi-squared isn't used for continuous, it's used for non-continuous data. And the same thing is true for Fisher's exact test as well. So again, as we're going through this, it's a lot of information to keep in mind. As you're writing your notes, reviewing, going over those considerations in terms of, again, categorical, nominal, continuous, non-continuous. I know that was a little bit ago that we looked at that, but that'll really help you as you think about correct statistical tests to use in the future. For our example here is our pool opens. So here we have a researcher measuring the BMI between 4 different groups. Let's looking to see if the means of them is different in any significant way. What would we select? Two sample t-test, ANOVA, chi-square, linear regression.
For seconds.
I like seeing that. So very strong response for B, ANOVA, and then kind of a small smattering between linear regression, chi-square, and a little bit for two sample. Exactly. So here we have 4 different groups. ANOVA is used for 3 or more. Why wouldn't it be for two sample t-test? We can't use it for multiple groups. Why wouldn't it be for chi-squared? Not used for multiple groups. And the key thing here with linear regression, remember for both linear and logistic regression, we use those to try to predict. So in this case, we're not trying to say whether BMI is predictive of anything. So therefore, that could help us rule out linear regression, because here we're not making a claim that this particular variable, in this case BMI, is predictive of any other kind of health outcome or information. For our next one here, so we're looking to estimate the probability who's going to develop type 2 diabetes based on things like BMI, cholesterol, and other factors. What would be our best test here?
Okay, 10 more seconds.
Okay, so we have a very little over half saying logistic regression, closely followed in second by linear regression. Nobody said two sample t-test, well done, and a few people looking at ANOVA. So it seems like the majority of people were maybe kind of 50-50 between C and D, which is excellent because if you're not certain, C and D would be the two to look at. The reason here why it is logistic regression, you correct in that it's a regression, so we're trying to, again, predict, we're trying to estimate. But the reason why it is logistic regression versus linear regression is here we have the dependent variable being outcome, in this case, type 2 diabetes, via a multi-set of data, multi-set of independent variables, sleep habits, activity, blood cholesterol. If it was only looking at type 2 diabetes and let's say exercise, minutes of exercise each week, then it would be linear regression because we're looking at one independent and one dependent variable. It's here at C because we have one dependent with multiple independent variables. You did it. We got through biostatistics. So briefly to look at some key information with epidemiology. This is our good friend, the epidemiologic triad. Because the idea with epidemiology is that we're trying to see the relationship between the host, which is typically the people in the community, or animals, depending on what we're looking at, the environment in which the host is existing, and some agent of interest that we are trying to study or explore. Hopefully, these are terms we've all become even more familiar with over the last several years. Endemic is when there is a consistently elevated rate of a particular disease. So if I live in a community that just always has a lot of ticks, and the temperature is such that the ticks are always out, certain tick-borne illnesses might always be endemic because they're just sort of always present. It goes from endemic to epidemic when it increases beyond what is expected. So an epidemic doesn't mean a disease that never existed entered a community. That disease might have already been there, but now we're seeing it at rates and levels that are higher than what is considered typical. And of course, pandemic is when we have an epidemic that is national and multinational in nature. With epidemiology, typically what we are looking at is cases of mortality and cases of morbidity, especially in relation to characteristics of interest. Some can be fixed and some can, of course, be transient. So a person's ethnicity is fixed, but a person's occupation, a person's age, these things are transient. They change over time. Excuse me. Mortality and morbidity, the key thing to remember here is with mortality, we're talking about number of deaths that are occurring, whereas morbidity, we're looking at cases of a disease that might be occurring. Concepts that can sometimes be a little tricky to keep in mind are things like incidence and prevalence. Excuse me. So incidence is referring to the number of new cases that are developing within a population. If it's over a defined period of time, this is going to be what's called cumulative incidence. Where if it's during just the time of observation, this is going to tell us the incidence rate. Prevalence is the proportion of the population of interest who have the characteristic at any given time during observation, regardless of when they develop the characteristic. So the key thing to be thinking of here is if we're looking at, let's say, type 2 diabetes in a community, prevalence would be everybody within this community with a current diagnosis of type 2 diabetes, whether they were diagnosed today or whether they were diagnosed 25 years ago. Everybody living within a particular population or community with this. Incidence would be just the new cases, during our time of either observation or an extended period of time, just the newer cases of diabetes that have been diagnosed. Incidence and prevalence and duration all influence one another. So if incidence is decreasing, meaning fewer new cases of, let's mix it up here. Let's say fewer new cases of hepatitis C because of vaccinations and other efforts, we have a smaller incidence of hepatitis C. But people with hepatitis C are living longer because of better treatment and other kinds of interventions. The prevalence is going to increase because even though the number of new cases is decreasing, the total number of people living with hepatitis C because of better treatment and other things, longer lived lives, prevalence is going to go up. If the incidence is increasing, so more cases, but the duration is short, we're going to see a decrease in prevalence. And this might be for something as routine as flus and RSV colds and respiratory illnesses, where let's say we're having a particularly bad year of a lot of these respiratory infections, but because of just the strength of the virus or the infectious agent or better healthcare interventions, the duration is short. The incidence might be high, but the total prevalence is going to decrease because at any given time, people are having fewer moments of their life living with this particular health condition. And if the incidence is decreasing, fewer new cases, and the duration is short, then of course we're going to see prevalence go down. So the common example that is often given for this is that if we had like a vessel or a container of some kind. So I always think of this as like I don't know, like an alchemist's laboratory material or something like that. Prevalence is the total amount of drops of water or fluid or marbles, however you want to think about it. Prevalence is just the number of items in the jar, the number of cases within the viewpoint of observation. Whether that marble or that drop of water has been there for a day or 10 years, it's in there. Incidence is going to be the number of new marbles, new drops of water, new ounces coming in. And duration is going to be impacting whether that is draining out quickly or slowly. This will also, of course, prevalence be impacted either by deaths in terms of whether people are dying more quickly or more slowly, or in case of something like, let's say, hepatitis C, well, there's a cure for that now. There's active treatment. So we're going to see prevalence go down as people can be actively treated and cured of their condition. Other things that thankfully we've looked at already, we've talked about ratio, we've talked about proportions and rates. Here's how we can apply them to epidemiology as well. So I went through that a little bit quickly just there because hopefully these things are fresh in your mind. So let's see. If we look at our next prompt here, if an administrator needs to know how many beds should be available at their location to treat people with a certain disease, how would this best be reflected? What do we need to know? Do we need to know the incidence, the prevalence, the cumulative incidence, or the mortality of this particular disease?
Okay.
Okay, so again, about 50% people said prevalence, followed by about 30% people with incidence. Again, it makes sense to kind of see it between those two. Excuse me. So prevalence. Why prevalence versus incidence? We need to be able to treat all people with disease X, not just the new ones, because anybody with this particular disease might need medical care. So in this case, an administrator would want to know the overall prevalence, the total number of people with this health condition, whether it's new or whether they were diagnosed a while ago, that might potentially need to come in for care because it's all current cases. Couple key things. Again, this is just to be familiar with, just some terminology about different kinds of rates. Crude death rate versus cause specific death rate. This is going to be just total number of deaths versus deaths from a specific cause. When it comes to infant and childhood, different kinds of rates, neonatal mortality rate refers to deaths among children less than 28 days of age. Post neonatal would be between 28 days and the first year of life. And infant mortality rates would be deaths among children less than a year of age. Maternal mortality rates is going to be deaths assigned to pregnancy related causes. So again, just some key things just to be familiar with here if these are not familiar terms. The other thing that's talked about quite a bit in epidemiology is risk and the difference between relative risk and attributable risk. Relative risk is the measure of the strength of the association or link between a risk factor and an outcome. It is expressed as a ratio of the risk incident in the exposed to the non-exposed. So people living with diabetes are blank times more likely disease outcome to be sedentary exposure than those who are not sedentary. Attributable risk helps to measure the excess risk associated with the risk factor. So in this case, relative risk is just going to show that people who are more sedentary have such a particular change in the risk of becoming type 2 diabetic. What attributable risk would help us to understand is just to what extent, how much that excess risk, in this case, let's say sedentariness, is associated, or I'm sorry, the outcome, I should say, excuse me, diabetes is associated with the risk factor being sedentary. Relative risk and risk in general is typically shown here in a basic 2x2 table, and this kind of table is commonly shown on the exam when looking at biostatistics epidemiology section. It will always be shared this way. So if you do work in this and you know that sometimes it can be oriented differently, please know this is how it will be oriented. First column is going to just show the exposed to the unexposed, the disease, those without the disease or the outcome of interest, and the total will always be shown in this way, A, B, C, D. Relative risk is calculated by taking the rate in the exposed and the rate in the unexposed. Now, what does A over A plus B hopefully remind you of? Proportion. So it's the proportion or the rate of the exposed divided into the proportion or the rate of the unexposed. So in this case, A are those exposed with the disease or the outcome of interest compared to everybody who's been exposed. And then the rate in the unexposed, or that proportion, is going to be the unexposed, people who never had the exposure but are still living with the disease or outcome of interest, compared to everybody who was free of that exposure. The way that risk and relative risk is typically shown here is going to be in some kind of numerical representation. If we see a relative risk of 1.0, no association between exposure and disease. And if we were to see something like this, hopefully this would make us say we would reject or fail to reject null hypothesis. What would we be seeing here? Hopefully we could see some of those connections there. If the relative risk, let's say, is 2.0, there's twice the risk of the disease in the exposed compared to the unexposed. If it's 1.6, it would be 60% increased risk. Risk doesn't always mean negative outcome, though, because if our relative risk comes at 0.5, it actually tells us that the exposure is protective, that those who receive the exposure have half the risk of those. That those that are exposed have half the risk of the disease compared to those that never had the exposure of interest. So what we would do if we were trying to calculate relative risk is that we would be given some kind of scenario. we would construct a basic 2x2 table. In this case, again, this would be provided to you on the exam. You would calculate the relative risk and then interpret what that means. So in this particular study, let's say we want to look at levels of anxiety in people who drink coffee compared to levels of anxiety in people who don't drink coffee. If relative risk, again, is A over A plus B divided by C over C plus D, what we would do is, okay, we would take A divided by A plus B divided by C over C plus D. In this case, we would take these numbers, we would calculate them out, and we could say that the relative risk was 5. What does that mean? People who drank coffee in this particular time of observation were 5 times as likely to be experiencing anxiety than those who were not. The attributable risk, again, we want to know just how much excess risk is being assessed or being attributed to this particular exposure. So the calculation of the formula for attributable risk is the same thing, A over A plus B, C over C plus D, but instead of dividing them into each other, it's basic subtraction. So we're taking this first rate or proportion, and then we are subtracting from it the unexposed rate or proportion. So just a key little differentiation there to keep in mind, that relative risk and attributable risk, same thing in terms of those rates or those proportions, but in relative risk, it's division, attributable risk, subtraction. So the following table shows the incidence of oral cancer in cigarette smokers and non-smokers. And our next example here, our next poll question: the attributable risk of oral cancer due to cigarette smoking. Would it be written out as, would be calculated as A, B, C, or D?
Ten more seconds.
Okay, so we see definitely A and C is the two most commonly answered ones, with C getting a little bit of a higher representation. Correct. If you answered A, again, you were absolutely on the right track. The difference being attributable risk subtraction. It would be proportion of the exposed. I'm sorry, a proportion of those with the outcome of interest, excuse me, subtracted the proportion of those without the exposure of interest, compared to with relative risk, it's going to be that division. So always give that question a nice slow read just to make sure you're looking at the correct one. Odds ratio. Now we're not so much looking at the risk, we're looking at the odds of an event occurring in one group versus the odds of an event of occurring in another group. This is typically going to be used in case-controlled studies and in cross-sectional studies, because we don't have the incidence data necessary to calculate relative risk. So the key thing to keep in mind here is that if we have incidence data, we can calculate relative risk. What is incidence? New cases of a disease. If we don't have that data, we're going to do an odds ratio instead. Same 2x2 table, we're going to see exposure with disease, exposure without disease, lack of exposure with disease, lack of exposure without disease. But in this case, the odds ratio is calculated as A times D over B times C. So again, just some general, how do you want to say, general just equations, things to keep in mind as you're planning out when you would be not so much utilizing one versus the other, but your ability to recognize, oh, that's odds ratio, that's relative risk, that's attributable risk. So in this case, we have in this example, we have a case control study. It's case control. We're not going to have incidence, so we're going to do odds ratio. but it's the same basic formula. Set up the 2x2 table, or in this case, it'll be provided to you. Calculate the odds ratio, just knowing what that odds ratio calculation looks like, and interpret the finding. So those with high lead versus low lead exposure in the case versus the control, odds ratio A times D, so 50 times 170 over B times C, 30 times 150, odds ratio of 1.89. So just something, again, to keep in mind there. I want to make sure we're going through with time. I apologize if anything is going through too fast, but I just want to make sure we can get through study design in the time that we have. Study design is similar to picking the right statistical method that we looked at previously, because the idea here is we want to make sure that we're designing a study in such a way that it is appropriate for the kind of question that we're trying to answer. Because not every kind of study is going to be appropriate for every population, or based on what kind of question it is that we're trying to answer. Just like we have descriptive and inferential statistics, we have descriptive and, in this case, analytic studies. Descriptive studies are typically observational in nature. We're just describing what we see as phenomenon in the community. Analytic studies could be observational, or they could be interventional or experimental, where we're actually testing the impact of something. So some key, again, things just to keep in mind regarding the different types of studies that we might select. A case study or a case report is only looking at the people with a condition of interest. A cross-sectional study, people are chosen in order to represent that larger given population. Cross-sectional studies are snapshots in time. I stood in the mall all day on a Saturday asking people questions. I can only really say that this is representing the population of interest at this moment in this place of time. People aren't selected on the basis of outcome or illness or exposure. So therefore, I can't use it to determine initial associations. I'm sorry, excuse me. So I can only use it to determine initial associations, excuse me, as well as identify prevalence of exposure or illness within a group. So maybe we don't know how many people are experiencing the outcome of interest, or we don't know how many people in the community have had the exposure of interest. So we're trying to look at initial associations here in this snapshot of time. It's providing prevalence, not incidence. So we would use odds ratio. Ecological studies describe entire populations. The key thing to remind here that we might see some questions about is what's called the ecological fallacy. And the ecological fallacy is when we make assumptions about individual people based on findings at the population level. Ecological information can only describe population. So I can't take what was found at the population level and then say that's absolutely going to apply to a specific individual or person. Case control studies is when we select people on the basis of having the disease, the event, the outcome of interest. What we do here is that we take people with the outcome of interest and we look back over time to see if they had different rates of exposure. So groups are going to be assigned based on outcome, with diabetes, without diabetes, with lung cancer, without lung cancer. We don't have incidence data, so we have to use odds ratio. And what we're looking at is exposure, which is typically collected retrospectively. So people living with lung cancer, were you ever exposed to asbestos? Versus people living without lung cancer, were you ever exposed to asbestos? That would be case control. People are categorized because of the outcome, and we look back in time to see if they had the exposure. Since we don't have incidence, we would calculate the odds ratio of people exposed to asbestos have a certain odds of developing lung cancer versus those who do not. A cohort study. In this case, we're selecting people on the basis of exposure. And we're looking to see if people develop disease at different rates. Now, this can be prospective, meaning we follow people over time, or it can be retrospective when we look back, into the past. This is typically good for rare exposures. Here we do have incidence, so we are able to actually calculate relative risk. Experimental studies is when we're actually having some kind of intervention typically, and we're investigating the role of that agent or that intervention, either in the prevention of a disease, treatment of a disease, et cetera. So I want to see, does this supplement help reduce anemia in pregnant individuals, right? That would be experimental. Systematic reviews and meta-analyses is when we take studies that pool the results of multiple independent studies and identify the evidence for determining the overall finding. So systematic reviews and meta-analyses is when we're not collecting new data, but we're taking already existing data and trying to come up with some kind of larger statement that the preponderance of data would suggest this kind of relationship or this kind of outcome. So something that hopefully might help in terms of trying to decide what kind of study are we looking at or what kind of study are we should we select. Is it experimental? Are we randomly allocating groups? That would tell us whether we have a randomized controlled trial or a non-randomized trial. If, however, we are not creating any kind of intervention and we're simply doing an observation, then the next question we ask ourselves is, are we testing a hypothesis? If the answer is no, it is a descriptive study. We are simply observing phenomenon as it occurs. If we are testing a hypothesis, it could still be descriptive, but more likely it's going to be an analytical study. And we're going to sample people. So how do we decide who gets to participate? Is whether we are sampling based on whether they've had the exposure. If they've had the exposure of interest, that would be a cohort study. If we're looking at people with the outcome of interest, it's going to be case control. And if we're not really sampling based on exposure or outcome, we're just getting that snapshot in time, we will have cross-sectional. We can also have different kinds of surveillance. Active surveillance, we're actively going out in the community. Passive surveillance, we're just relying on existing reporting systems. Digital, we're not really even going into the community at all. We're just searching for information online. And sentinel is when we're monitoring a specific and special community to look for changes in distribution of a disease just within that particular community. The other things we want to look at when it comes to study design is validity. Internal validity refers to whether the study design and the data analysis truly answers the research question without bias, meaning this was a well-designed study and the findings of it are valid. External validity refers to whether the study findings can be generalized to other contexts or larger population. Typically, the higher our internal validity, the lower the external validity. So sometimes that can be a limitation of research, is that we have a fantastically designed study, but whether these findings are really applicable to the larger population is another question. And we might have a study that's very applicable to the larger population, but that can sometimes impact how well designed and conducted the study was itself. So there's a bit of a give and take there. When we look at chance, this is just mere random variation. How do we control for chance? Good, robust sample size. The other thing we're trying to be thoughtful of with study design is bias. Bias away from the null causes us to believe there is an association when there isn't. Bias towards the null causes us to believe that there is no association when there truly is one. So as you go through your own preparation and notes, think about how bias and type 1 and type 2 errors relate to one another. There's different kinds of bias we can have. Selection bias. How did we focus on participant selection? How did we make sure that we had a good, robust sample that's representative of the population of interest? Do we have observational bias, where people have already entered the study, but the way that they are observed or are spoken to or communicated with can introduce bias? So interviewer bias is, if I feel that my interviewer has clear body language that leads me to think they really want me to answer one way versus the other, that can change my answer. Recall bias, it's hard to remember the past. So if we're doing a retrospective study and asking people, what did you used to eat when you were 10 and now this person's 45, it might be a little harder to recall 3.5 decades in the past. And we can also have misclassification error when participants are incorrectly classified into the wrong population. Differential is when bias is between different groups. Non-differential misclassification error is when that bias is equal across all groups. Now, confounding is different. Confounding occurs when researchers are evaluating that relationship between exposure and outcome, but there is another variable, a third variable is distorting that finding. It's not on the causal pathway, but it can introduce bias nonetheless. So we use things like randomization, stratification, et cetera, to try to reduce the opportunity for a confounder to come in and confuse that relationship. We also have what's called effect modification. And what effect modification shows is that the magnitude is based on a third exposure. So let's say we're looking at the relationship between asbestos exposure and lung cancer, and there is an effect there. But we know that smokers who have also asbestos exposed people who also smoke, we're going to see even higher levels of lung cancer. So if we're not aware of that effect modification, we might overestimate the relationship between asbestos exposure and lung cancer because that exposure to tobacco products also exacerbated that relationship between the initial exposure of interest and outcome of interest. So with confounding and effect modification, both of them are referring to third variables. The key thing to differentiate here, a confounder is distorting the true association, whereas the effect modifier is actually clarifying the association, but it's making it stronger than it would have been otherwise. We use stratification and other kinds of proper sampling to try to control for both. If the variable of interest is a confounder, we're going to use that stratum specific estimate. So again, breaking people up into specific strata. If the variable is, however, an effect modifier, stratum specific estimates will be significantly different. And so this is perhaps getting into areas that are a bit more nuanced and complex than you may be assessed for. The key thing here is, again, just to be able to recognize the difference between effect modifiers and confounders based on how it is distorting or exacerbating the relationship between exposure and outcome. Small thing to be aware of here, when we're trying to determine causation versus correlation, we have what are called Koch's postulates. Just be aware that causation and correlation are not necessarily, of course, the same thing. If we're trying to truly show a causative effect, there are certain criteria that need to be in place. And so these criteria of causality, this might be more effective for chronic diseases, and this might be more related to your discussion on diseases and public health. But just be aware of these 9 criteria in terms of what coherence is referring to, specificity, plausibility, et cetera. These would be concepts used to try to determine whether we can actually make a statement that this exposure causes this outcome, or whether we're saying that this exposure is correlated. There's a correlational relationship with the outcome. When we're talking about prevention, we have primordial, primary, secondary, and tertiary. So in epidemiology, primordial prevention is preventing the risk factors of disease at the population level instead of at the more individual level. Primary prevention is similar, but it's typically more at the individual level. Secondary prevention is screening. So breast cancer screening, prostate cancer screening, skin cancer screening, high blood pressure screenings. Secondary prevention is trying to find evidence of potential disease at the preclinical level, early diagnosis. Whereas tertiary prevention is after diagnosis and potential changes to health have already occurred. So tertiary prevention is treatment, rehabilitation, and support. Screening is happening at these preclinical stages, typically secondary prevention. What we ask ourselves here is the feasibility. How likely is it that our target audience is going to participate in a screening program or in a prevention program like a class or an educational campaign? So as we're coming to our conclusion here, just looking again at some examples. So for this particular kind of population, we have a population of people experiencing high rates of mortality due to cervical cancer. Local public health researchers are implementing a screening program. Is this primary prevention, secondary, tertiary, quaternary?
More seconds.
All right, so primary and secondary were the two most commonly answered. Secondary prevention being the most robustly answered. Correct, because it's screening. Anytime we're screening, it's secondary. The difference between primary prevention and secondary is primary prevention is we are trying to prevent the disease from occurring in the first place. Secondary prevention, getting a skin cancer screening doesn't prevent me from having skin cancer, but participation in skin cancer screening helps me identify possible mutation, early changes, or early signs of skin cancer that might allow me to have earlier interventions and treatments and therefore reduce the likelihood of a more serious case. So just keep that in mind between primary and secondary. Primary, there's no disease and we're hoping to keep it that way. Secondary prevention, we're trying to do early screening to catch things at that early level. Next question here. What kind of intervention is this going to be? What kind of observation, I should say? Is it sentinel, passive, digital, or predictive? And really read this question because there can be some confusion. So really think about what it's asking.
Give it about 10 more seconds.
And we're almost at the end, everyone, I promise.
Yes.
All right, so Sentinel received the most votes, followed by passive, then digital, and then predictive. So yes, Sentinel. So if you answered Sentinel correct, what makes this Sentinel versus, let's say, something like passive? It is ongoing and they are actively visiting. They're actively interacting with, going into. Passive would just be we're waiting for the reports to come in. But since they're visiting those medical offices, this means they are actively they're sentinels. They're actively going out into that community. So that's going to be always that key word about visiting or engaging with, interacting with. Last kind of key area is about different forms of screenings. So the key things to be familiar with different kinds of screening tools is sensitivity versus specificity. Sensitivity talks about the ability to correctly identify people with the disease of interest. Specificity of a test is its ability to correctly identify the people who do not have the disease of interest. So the ability of a test to have true positives is its sensitivity. The ability of a test to indicate true negatives would be its specificity. With tests, positive predictive value is the probability that the positive test result is real. So if I get a positive COVID test, what is the probability that that is a true positive and not a false positive? That is its PPV, or its positive predictive value. This is typically more useful to the patient. I want to know if that positive test is real. Sensitivity is typically a little more useful to the clinician, but we can see the relationship between positive predictive values and sensitivity. Negative predictive value is the probability that a negative test is truly negative and is not a false negative. When we're talking about clinical diseases, these are typically compared to, biopsy or other kind of diagnostic information to really determine, again, positive and negative predictive values. So be familiar with these equations here. Again, very similar to what we've seen in terms of things like relative risk, things like proportions. So negative and positive predictive values is we're looking at the true negatives and the true positives over the false negatives and the true negatives versus the false positives and true positives. Whereas sensitivity and specificity, we are mixing up those denominators a little bit, where sensitivity is we're taking the true positives, looking at the true positives plus the false negatives, and the specificity, the true negatives, divided into the false positives and the true negatives. So again, that can get a little bit confusing sometimes, but if you sit with it for a moment or two, again, just kind of commit it to some memorization or some repetition if these are new concepts, they do tend to make sense. But again, what we have here is a proportion because the denominator contains the numerator. All right, last one. A public health researcher is studying whether an at-home HIV testing kit is accurate in truly indicating whether an individual is negative for HIV infection. So this researcher is testing what? The specificity, sensitivity, positive predictive value, or odds ratio of this at-home testing kit.
Two more seconds.
Okay, so specificity comes in its strongest, followed by sensitivity. Good, because those would definitely be the 50-50 choice between the two. Couple people with positive predictive value, specificity. So again, part of this is just memorization, refreshing again if these are new terms, but specificity is the ability of a test to identify those who truly are negative, those who do not have the outcome of interest, whereas sensitivity is looking at the ability to identify those who truly do have the disease or the outcome of interest. Oh, I'm sorry, I forgot. I had one more. So which of the following estimates of an odds ratio would most strongly suggest a computational error? Okay, I think I actually have one more after this. I'm sorry.
There's two more, I think.
Two more. Oh my goodness, I'm forgetting myself. Thank you. So of these examples, if you were to see these, on the outcome of an assessment, which would lead us to believe that there was some incorrect computation happening while putting together an odds ratio?
More seconds, everyone.
Okay, so most people answered C, correct. You're never going to have a negative odds ratio because just think about that in terms of the division. How could that ever occur? So if you ever see something with a neg, now if you saw 20.9, that would mean there was almost 21 times the odds. It's a large number, but it could technically be true. But we're never going to see a negative there. Epidemiologic triad, that triangle I showed right at the beginning. Again, this is just familiarity. This is just recognition. Which of these is showing those three components of this triad, of that relationship between these three factors?
More seconds.
All right, so we see B having the most, followed a little bit by D. B, it's host, agent, environment. Why wouldn't it be D? Host, agent, exposure. Agent and exposure would basically be referring to the same thing. It's the exposure, the phenomenon, the item of interest. So that's why it would be host, the person or the population, the agent, the causative factor we're looking at, and the environment that the agent and the host are existing within. Okay, I apologize. I threw a lot of you right at the end. I apologize. So last question. An investigator is interested in studying people, right, with a confirmed diagnosis of colon cancer to see if there's an association with a saturated fat diet. The control group are people without diagnosis of colon cancer. Which would be the best study design?
More seconds, everyone.
Okay, so case control is the most robustly answered C, followed by a cohort study, and then finally by randomized control. So yes, case control. Why? We're sampling people based on outcome. In this case, whether they have colon cancer or don't have colon cancer. It would be a cohort study if it was based on exposure. In this case, we would be categorizing people whether they ate a high saturated fat diet in the past or a low saturated fat diet in the past. And the reason why it's not B, a randomized controlled trial, we're not assigning people, right? People aren't being assigned to a high saturated or a low saturated fat diet. So that's why C here would be the most correct. I know that this is a lot. This is a hefty domain for a relatively small amount of questions, but go through some of these basic concepts and especially the most foundational aspects, because if you know how study designs are designed, if you know whether we're looking at continuous versus other kinds of data, that can then help you construct understanding of questions, even if you're coming up against something you haven't seen before. So I'm going to stop sharing there. Again, hefty amount, but I think everybody did very well. I know we're at the end of our time, so I just want to quickly look at some of the questions that have been posed before. So with rate, would just the denominator be for a specified time? Wouldn't the numerator be for, oh, great question. So yes, basically with rate, the idea would be, people with hepatitis B over the last 6 months compared to in the total population over the last 6 months. It's typically focused on the denominator just because it tends to be written, within the population over this time. But correct, it could be seen in any of those different kinds of ways. Is there a way to determine whether something is a confounder rather than an effect modifier? Great question. So the way that a question might be a phrase in that way would all be about whether or not this third variable is emphasizing or increasing a relationship or whether it's distorting a relationship. So the way that a question would be phrased here would be something like this third variable. I'm just trying to think of a quick example of, let's say, bad sleep. How is that, if it's increasing the exposure between stress and high blood pressure, would that be a confounder or an effect modifier? Because it's showing that there's already a known relationship and this is making it worse, that would tell us that it's an effect modifier. Versus if the question was phrased in such a way that it's making it seem like the outcome is more distorted or unclear, then we would know that it is a confounder in that way. I think I see one more. Is gender considered nominal or ordinal? So gender, ethnicity, those kinds of demographics are typically nominal because they can't be ranked. Male doesn't come before female, and that doesn't come before non-binary or intersex or something else along those lines. So that's why it would be nominal in that way. Did I get them all?
There's one more. The reason the year of graduation.
The reason year of graduation is not nominal is because indicates some order or distance between birth and graduate. Correct, exactly. Because with that, while it is ranked, Maybe some people take time off, some people don't necessarily graduate all at the same time. So while we might expect a certain amount of time in between, we know people, maybe they were out for a year because they were sick, or it doesn't tell. So we know there's an inherent ranking, but we can't 100% say that there's always a definitive sequence of time in terms of so many weeks, months, years in between. Great questions. Excellent questions from everybody. Well done. All will be good, I promise. If anybody has any other questions about this that I can be of any help for, please, reach out to NBPHE, and I'd be happy to provide any information that I can. Use your study guide. The book really is effective. The practice questions are incredibly effective, and I know that you will be successful. And thank you for taking this very intense, but very well done 2-hour ride with everybody. Thank you for being here today.
And thank you to you for presenting on this very data-driven topic.
Yes.
We definitely appreciate it. And
I
so
know.
everyone, our next session will be on program management, which is this Thursday. So I look forward to seeing you all then. Thank you.
Bye, everybody.